And we are in Amos, chapter number 7. We have seen two visions that a Lord had given to Amos, and Amos's struggle with the Lord. And there in verses 1 through 3, he had given a vision of locusts that would come to destroy the crops and destroy the harvest of the nation of Israel. But Amos intervened on the behalf of God's people, and God stayed that judgment. The second judgment we looked at last week was that of a devouring fire in verses 4 through 6, a drought to go through the land. And God's judgment had so moved the prophet Amos that he cried to the Lord again and begged him to cease. And once more, God relented. And then there's the third vision that we see starting in verse number 7. The vision was that of the plumb line. There in verse 7, there in Amos chapter number 7, thus he showed me, and behold, the Lord stood upon a wall made by a plumb line, with a plumb line in his hand. And the Lord said unto me, Amos, what seest thou? And I said, a plumb line. Then said the Lord, behold, I will set a plumb line in the midst of my people Israel, and I will not again pass by them any more. And the high places of Isaac shall be desolate, and the sanctuaries of Israel shall be laid waste. And I will rise against the house of Jeroboam with the sword. Then Amaziah, the priest of Bethel, sent to Jeroboam, king of Israel. This is Jeroboam the second, by the way, when you read them in the Kings and the Chronicles. This is not the first Jeroboam, which started the whole idol worship mess for the northern kingdom of Israel, but a descendant of his, Jeroboam the second. And Amaziah the priest of Bethel sent to Jeroboam the king of Israel, saying, Amos hath conspired against thee in the midst of the house of Israel, and the land is not able to bear all his words. For thus Amos saith, Jeroboam shall die by the sword, and Israel shall surely be led away captive out of their own land. So Amaziah said unto Amos, O thou seer, go flee thee away into the land of Judah, and there eat bread, and prophesy there. But prophesy not again any more at Bethel, for it is the king's chapel, and it is the king's court. And we will stop there tonight. The vision of the plumb line. For those who may not be familiar with the plumb line, as I am not, a plumb line is an instrument that was used to test whether a wall was straight and true. If it was vertical and completely vertical. If it leaned one way or the other and it wasn't plumb to the plumb line, they would have to tear it all down and build it all again. They also made sure that the walls of a building would be able to connect with each other. If they weren't able to connect with each other, they would have to start all over again. They laid the foundation of the building, they laid the cornerstone, and they built the walls according to the cornerstone. So the cornerstone had to be, if you will, plumb or straight or even. And we see that Amos saw, as it says there in verse number 7, thus he showed me, and behold, the Lord stood upon a wall made by a plumb line, with a plumb line in his hand. So the Lord stood on top of the wall, and he dropped the line, and the plumb line is basically a string with a weight on it. And by matching the line to the wall, the workers could tell if the wall was upright. God has given us a plumb line in our life. It is God's law. He gave Israel that plumb line. God's law, God's word. That is the plumb line to help keep us straight. And when we vary from the law of God, then the Lord has to deal with that and has to deal with us. And God measures his people to see how true they are to the pattern of his word, if they are upright in conduct and in character. And he found the northern kingdom of Israel lacking, not straight. The prophet Isaiah in Isaiah chapter 28 and verse number 17. Isaiah chapter 28 and verse number 17. The prophet Isaiah writes to the nation of Israel, "Judgment also will I lay to the line, and the righteousness to the plummet. And the hail shall sweep away the refuge of lies, and the water shall overflow the hiding places." In Amos's time, as we mentioned, the Lord found that Israel was out of plumb, and therefore had to be destroyed. Just as a wall that is out of plumb, they have to tear it down and rebuild it again. God was going to have to tear down his people in order to rebuild them again. And this would include, as we read there in verse number 9 of our text, Israel's high places and their sanctuaries where they worshiped contrary to God's law. Because the only place the Jews were to bring their sacrifice, according to Leviticus chapter 17, verses 1 through 7, was to the temple in Jerusalem. That's where they were to worship. And if they had to travel there to do it, then they had to travel there to do it, to give their sacrifices. Now, Jeroboam the first, when he took over the 10 tribes of Israel after the split of the nation of Israel after the reign of Solomon, he got nervous with his people traveling all the way to Jerusalem because they would like King Rehoboam rather than they would like King Jeroboam, and therefore they might stay there in the land of Judah and not come back to the land of Israel. So, I'm going to make it easier for them to worship God. And I'm going to set up some golden calves. I'm going to set up 2 golden calves and 2 cities here in the northern kingdom. And the people can go and sacrifice there. Don't even have to travel all the way to Jerusalem, such an expense and such a bother to be able to go and to do that all the time when you have to do your sacrifices every year and everything. It's just horrible. So I'm going to make it easier for them. And it was Jeroboam that had ingrained in the 10 tribes of Israel idol worship and sacrifice to idols. They were already doing it. You understand that throughout their history. In the days of the judges, they were worshiping idols and sacrificing to idols. Jeroboam just said, okay, I'm going to make it legal. Sound familiar? Politicians know best. So they say. One of the most terrible lines that the Lord says to the nation of Israel is there in the last part of verse number 8, where he said, I will not again pass by them anymore. God had said, I have had enough. I will not spare the people any longer. The judgment was coming. That statement is certainly an ominous statement. The nation of Israel, that northern kingdom, had gone too far, and now there was no hope. We have to be careful as a nation here in the United States of America. We don't cross that line. The line that God has said, I have had enough. I am now going to judge you. And there is no hope of getting out of it. The northern kingdom of Israel was there at this time, in the time of Amos. God had the Assyrians ready to be able to invade them and to be able to take them into captivity, which they did. And for this reason, God didn't intercede for the land as he did twice before. Remember the first two visions. Amos had sympathy and empathy for the people and for the farmers. The invasion of the locusts and the devastating heat, the fire, the drought. But now Amos knew that even if he did intercede on behalf of the people, it would do him no good. Because God has said, I will not spare them anymore. I've had enough. Like Jeremiah, like the prophet Jeremiah, who did not pray for the people on several different occasions and didn't intercede for the people, that is recorded in the book of Jeremiah. In Jeremiah chapter 7 and verse number 16. God speaking here through the prophet Jeremiah. Jeremiah 7 and verse 16. Therefore, pray not thou for this people, neither lift up cry nor prayer for them, neither make intercession to me, for I will not hear thee. A few chapters over in Jeremiah chapter 11 and verse number 14. Therefore, pray not thou for this people, neither lift up a cry or prayer for them, for I will not hear them in the time that they cry unto me for their trouble. And again in Jeremiah chapter 14 and verse number 11. Then said the Lord unto me, pray not for this people for their good. We understand that discipline can be a good thing. It's hard to go through, but it can be a good thing. It can bring about a change in one's heart, in one's life, in one's behavior. And God was going to do this with his people in the days of Amos. What he was doing was for their good. They may not have seen it that way. The chastening of the Lord can be grievous, yes. It would, when we go through it, we're not seeing it that way. But in the end, it brings forth better fruit. And we saw that in the southern kingdom of Judah when they came back from the Babylonian captivity after 70 years under the Babylonians. They seemed to get their heart right with God. They seemed to see revival and renewal during that time, in the days of Ezra and Nehemiah and Zerubbabel, who brought groups out at different times from the Babylonian Empire. By then it was the Mede and the Persian Empire, because the Medes and the Persians had conquered the Babylonians. Sometimes it's hard to keep up. Can't tell the players without a scorecard. But God had brought them back. During that time. And during that time, God's people had learned their lessons. But we see that Amos was not only struggling with the Lord, but he was also struggling with the authorities of his day, which take up the last half of the chapter here in Amos chapter 7. We read some of those verses in verses 10 through 17. Israel's main sanctuary, if you will, its main church building, if you will, was in the city of Bethel. And it was the king's chapel. It was a special place. It was the king's chapel, where the king went. And God had told Amos that the sanctuary would be destroyed, that King Jeroboam II would be killed. This wasn't an easy message for Amos to proclaim, because Amos was attacking both the government and the religion of the nation. Yet Amos faithfully went to Bethel and preached the word of God. And 4 different messages were involved in this event that took place here in the last half of Amos chapter 7. In verses 10 and 11, we saw how the priest Amaziah reported to King Jeroboam. In verses 10 and 11, where we read, since the king had appointed Amaziah to be priest, he had an obligation to tell the king what the former preacher was saying to the people. See, Amaziah's alliances weren't with the Lord. They were with the king. The king didn't bother to go hear Amos himself, although it would have done him good to listen and to obey what Amos was saying. If the king had obeyed what God was saying through the prophet Amos, they could have avoided this. Instead, Jeroboam didn't care to hear what God's prophet had to say. He got it secondhand. And we all understand what happens when you get things secondhand. You ever play a telephone game? You have 8 or 10 people lined up, and at the beginning of the line, you start out with a statement, and you're supposed to repeat the statement all the way down the line, and it becomes a totally different statement when it gets to the end. That's usually what happens when you hear things secondhand. And the messenger, the priest, had a bias against Amos. Therefore, his partiality or his bias would show in what he reported to the king. So he wasn't getting a non-biased, accurate message. And the king couldn't bother himself to be able to go hear the prophet himself, because Jeroboam was very comfortable and complacent. And he wasn't about to have some visiting farmer tell him what to do. I'm the king. Nobody's going to tell me what to do. Yeah, where have I heard that before? And then we go from the message of Amaziah to the king to Amaziah's message to Amos there, where we read in verses 12 and 13. Now, of course, Jeroboam II, the king, didn't want to hear that his chapel and shrines would be destroyed and that he would die. That'd be the last thing he wanted to hear. And that the Assyrians would come and exile his people. Such a pessimistic message. And that pessimistic message, even though it was true, had to be silenced. It was like the Boston College football coach that I heard this week. Their team's doing terrible. They're 1-8, and one of the reporters asked, a doom and gloom type of question. Are you sad and everything around your program? And the coach said, "We're not sad. I don't know about you. We're not looking down. We're looking up. We're going to go out in the field and we're going to go play our opponent. We're going to go play our opponent on Saturday, and we're going to do our darndest to be able to go and win the game. We're not negative around here. We're positive." It's good to have a positive outlook in the midst of negativity, but you can't deny the negativity that is there. You can't ignore it. But we can't. King Jeroboam II thought, we can't have this, this farmer preacher going around with this pessimistic message of, doom and gloom and destruction. What are the people going to think? So the king told his priest, Amaziah, to tell Amos to go home where he belonged. And also Amaziah said unto Amos there in Amos 7 and verse 12, "O thou seer, go flee thee away into the land of Judah, and there eat bread and prophesy there." Take your pessimistic message home. That's where Amos was from. He was from the southern kingdom of Judah, called to be a prophet to the northern kingdom of Israel. He called Amos a seer, which in this case means a visionary. Amaziah claimed that there was no validity to Amos's message. He only dreamed it up. God didn't give you this prophecy. You just had too much pizza and had got an upset stomach, and you dreamed all this up. It's not really going to happen. And an even scarier thing than being positive in the face of negativity is to deny that anything is wrong. We went through that as a nation recently, not too long ago, where we had a president in the White House that said everything was rosy. And he didn't know where he was half the time. But everything's great. There's no doom and gloom coming here. Because that old prophet Amos, he just dreamed it up. They would be in for a rude awakening. He also said, the priest also suggested that Amos was also a coward who could run away if the king began to deal with him. If the king went to arrest Amos or throw him in prison or put him in stocks or, whatever, or even tried to take his life, he could run back to Judah. But I believe any called man of God worth his salt, when there's trouble, doesn't run and hide. He stands and faces the trouble that is there. And I've known of pastors who do it, when things go bad in a church and things start to go south in the church, they feel they're called to another place. And they leave the church worse than when they got there, usually. But Amos was being accused of being a coward. Amaziah hinted that Amos was a hireling prophet who was part of a conspiracy and was only interested in earning bread. The only reason why he was a preacher was to get paid for it. If I ever get to the point in my ministry where I preach just in order to get paid, it's time for me to retire from the ministry. Because I can honestly say, and I have said before in churches that I have preached in before and churches that I have pastored before, I'm not in this for the money. If I were in it for the money, I'd be on TV. And then I would have a different wife, one who wore a lot of makeup and cried a lot. And my life would be very different than it is now. If I wanted to make money, the ministry would not have been my first choice. Not when you look at the service call costs of a plumber or an electrician to come to your house, just to come and see what the problem is. Not to fix the problem, just to come see what the problem is. It's kind of like being a doctor, He charges you $250 to come in and say hello. And then he starts to earn his money. But Amaziah was saying of Amos that you're just into this being a prophet thing for the money. Finally, Amaziah told Amos to get out and to stay out, because the king's chapel was the elite, and he was nothing but a common farmer who thought he was a prophet. It was a bitter speech that may have cut to the prophet's heart deeply, because words do hurt, and they do cut. And these accusations placed upon the prophet Amos by the priest Amaziah and the king probably hurt him deeply. And he could have cut and run. Could have went home and hid. But as we'll see next time, he responded in a very different way, which we will look at next time, because our time has been accomplished.